Without further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Don Howard to Myanmar and to our lectures. So let me introduce a bit about Dr. Gretchen Don Howard. So Dr. Don Howard is a research specialist with the Center on the Economics and Demography of Aging at the University of California at Berkeley. And she's also a fellow of the East-West Center in Hawaii. Dr. Don Howard has contributed to the NTA Research Network for over 10 years, and she has also maintained the account for the United States and providing technical support to the global network of over 60 countries, producing comparative results on the age dimension of economic activity. And she is also the principal investigator of the Counting Women's Walk project. Perhaps you can explain a little bit about it. And regularly advises the growth and economic opportunities for women. And one of the largest GROW, which is one of the largest programs on gender research. And she also advises the United Nations, the US National Academy of Sciences, and other organizations. Dr. Don Howard has a BA in Economics and Mathematics from Yale University, and an MA in Statistics, and a PhD in Demography from the University of California at Berkeley.
Thank you, Edgar, and other partners for the invitation. It's an honor to be able to come to Myanmar. It's my first time, so far so good. I'll be speaking today about whether Myanmar can benefit from the demographic dividend and the National Transfer Accounts Network that is a network of diverse research teams, as was mentioned, in over 60 countries. And some of these research teams are in academic institutions and universities. Some of them are government institutions. Some of them are in national statistical offices. So we have very much a government and academic partnership in these research teams. And there's sort of an overall technical support infrastructure that I'm part of that brings countries into this network to do this research. And as I said, as we are in over 60 countries in the world, it's a very diverse set of countries, from the most high-income, well-developed countries to many low-income countries who are just starting out with sort of national statistical infrastructure. And all of these countries have their own specific concerns about how age and population is going to affect their economies. So we're able to, in one single framework, address many different concerns of many different kinds of countries. So this is really small, but it's just an overview of what I want to talk about. First, address the fact that populations are changing. The whole world is going through demographic transition, and our age structures, our population growth rates, our population sizes are changing rapidly, and those changes are projected to continue. So then the second piece of the talk will be that population affects economic outcomes. And how is that? Well, there are many ways in which population affects economy, but the way we'll be discussing is how the generational economy is configured in different countries. And when I say generational economy, what I mean is the age dimension of economic activity. More about that in a bit. And then we'll discuss actually what the National Transfer Accounts Framework is, how that measures the generational economy, and then how that relates to this concept of the demographic dividend, how we can use NTA, National Transfer Accounts estimates, to understand the potential for the demographic dividend and see how Myanmar might realize that, and how other Asian countries are using NTA to understand the potential for their demographic dividends, or to see if their dividend period is past, to understand what future population aging may do to their economies. And so at the beginning of the week, last week, I was in Thailand. The National Transfer Accounts Asia Project had the final meeting of a 5-year project to extend the framework and the methodology to many countries throughout Asia. So we have a lot of really good comparative data on the region now. And but Myanmar is one of the few countries that we don't have a research team in, so there is opportunity there. So part of the reason I'm here. So, and then, so the NTA is a pretty simple framework. It doesn't have a lot of feedbacks. It's not a very it's more of an accounting exercise. And so the final piece, depending on how much time we have, will be the final sort of square or hexagon down there says it can't be that simple. So then, of course not. There are many policy implications to achieving a demographic dividend, and there are more complex models. And the Counting Women's Work project is one of those extensions of the basic methodology that I hope we'll have time to discuss in detail. So to begin with, populations are changing. Pretty much everyone who is involved in social science development and economic change knows this. The world is ending a period of unprecedented population growth. We will likely never see periods of population growth rates as high as we have seen in the past 50 years. Fertility is falling in pretty much every country in the world. Mortality is falling. Life expectancy is increasing. Population growth is going to be slower going forward. Population age structures are going to be older. In some countries, they're aging very rapidly. Many of those countries are in Asia, Japan, Singapore. In the next few decades, China will be the fastest aging population in the world. Myanmar is also experiencing all of these global trends, but with their own unique trajectory. So just to set the stage, what is graphed here is the United Nations estimates and projections of Myanmar's population, total population size. Now, the United Nations has a very large workforce estimating global population, estimating this data and other data on population for every country in the world. Many countries feel that the UN's method doesn't get them right, their estimates aren't accurate, or their projections don't reflect expectations in their own countries. So that certainly may be the case in Myanmar. I'm not familiar enough with how Myanmar is projecting its own population to know, but this is the UN projections, at least a place to start discussing expectations of the future. So you can see that starts in 1950. I hope that everybody can see that well enough. So in 1950, we have very consistent rapid population growth, but starting here, so this is 2017, and from here it's projection. So this is the United Nations median projection, sort of the best guess of the future. And then we have bands for high and low fertility scenarios. So in the median projection, population growth will be over in about 2050 or before 2050. If fertility is higher, which would be very unexpected. No one has sort of returned to a high fertility, no country has returned to a high fertility regime after having decreases. There have been slight increases in some places, but no big turnaround. So that red line is highly unlikely. The green line is a somewhat more likely scenario. So the blue line involves an assumption that over the long term, Myanmar's fertility will go to replacement. It will go to the level that would keep, that would just about replace the existing population. You still get population decline in the blue line because of the existing age structure. But many countries, it seems that the expectation is closer to the green line, that actually fertility will will keep falling below replacement. And there's no particular reason to believe it'll go back up anywhere. So this is from a great website called Our World in Data, if anyone ever wants to do some productive Googling around instead of Facebook, which I find super depressing these days. Go to Our World in Data and just waste your time because it has amazing, it's just a really wonderful resource. And so this is life expectancy in countries. Myanmar is in the blue and regional neighbors are also charted here. So you can see this is a pretty hopeful story, the degree to which life expectancy has risen in all of these countries. It's also a cautionary tale. We see what happened in Cambodia during the war period. Yeah. But overall, this trend is very hopeful. Long life, lower mortality. So this is the portion of child mortality that accounts for that. Again, so starting in 1950 and going down to 2015 here. So Myanmar in yellow, in the mid-century, really rapid decline in child mortality. More consistent decline with neighbors through the second half, but overall a very dependable trend. Now this is fertility. So this statistic is children per woman. That means if a woman were to have children at the existing observed fertility rates today, how many children would she have in her lifetime? So we can see that in 1950, countries were starting at a very high level, 5, 6, 7 children per woman. And then in the second half of the century, it starts to decline very rapidly. China, you can see in the red here, has the fastest decline. It's always interesting to me to see many people don't realize that the one-child policy actually got enacted here. So many people think the one-child policy in China caused the really fast decline in fertility, but it's not the case. That policy actually was enacted after most of the decline was already realized. And right here, the one-child policy was rescinded, and we've seen no increase in fertility since then. So just an interesting fertility dynamic. So Myanmar in this graph turned out to be purple, and steady decline, no indication that it's going to rebound at all. Age-specific fertility rates continue to fall bit by bit, year after year. So for replacement fertility is about where a little below Bangladesh right here, but it looks like even the countries that are higher than that level right now are heading to below replacement, and China and Thailand significantly below replacement fertility, which is going to affect their population growth rates and age structure, as we'll see in a moment. So this process, demographers refer to it as the demographic transition. Mortality falls, then fertility falls. This has been the pattern in most countries that we've seen, variation somewhat, but we can broadly characterize as first mortality decline, then fertility decline. This causes big changes over time in population growth rate and age structure, and every country in the world has either moved through this process or is going through it. Nobody is maintaining really high levels of fertility and mortality anymore. Some isolated pockets of particular communities within some countries, yes, but overall at the national level, this is a global phenomenon. So the demographic transition has pretty strong effects on age structure. So what you're seeing here are, demographers call these population pyramids. Yesterday I realized they would be better characterized as population pagodas, because the shape is actually a little more pagoda-like than pyramid strictly. Yes. So, okay, so over on the top left is Myanmar's population pagoda. So what you see here is starting at the bottom and going up, each layer is an age group. The number of females in that age group is in the yellow on the right. The number of males is in blue on the left. So in 1950, in Myanmar, the number of infants was the largest piece of the pagoda, and then it got a little smaller, and then narrows sharply until at the very top there's hardly anyone. The eldest groups are very small. Go forward to 2017, and that structure has changed a lot. So we see the falling fertility effect, that actually newborn cohorts are smaller than the ones that they're replacing. And we still have a small amount at the top, but it's getting larger at the oldest age groups. So the projection down to 2050 finds that shape moving up. So you can see there this sort of bulge generation moving through the age structure. And then in 2100, we expect that if things remain the way they are today, who knows what the world will be like at 2100, however, but at least projecting forward, the pagoda is going to look more like a column. And just to show another regional neighbor, this is the same information, but for China, so 1950, and the scales change here, of course, because China is a much more populous country. So similarly to Myanmar, 1950, China's population had a big base. By 2017, these this low fertility has already had a big effect on the age structure. It is expected to be upside down by 2050, just in terms of where the largest groups are relative to the base, and even more so by 2100. And again, the population isn't necessarily shrinking all that much, it's just these scales are changing. Another regional neighbor here is Thailand on the right, Myanmar, or sorry, on the right, yes. Can't tell my left from my right. So Thailand still contrasts with Myanmar. Similar story though, that there is low fertility now and it's going to move through the age structure. So this is what gives us the idea of the demographic dividend. That these guys, right now in 2017 in Myanmar, this is 10 to 20, they're going to enter the labor force in the next 2 decades. And so you'll have a very large labor force relative to the number of children that they have to pay for in their households, that they have to educate through their taxes, and also relatively few elders who they'll also have to support through either family transfer systems or public transfer systems. So this is where the idea of the demographic dividend comes in. You have this big generation, you have your overall population favoring productivity over consumption. So the population growth rate, speed of the overall population growth affects aggregate economic growth. That's one thing that I didn't talk about with the age pyramids, but it's something that, at least in terms of direct foreign investment internationally, sometimes your economy will look better if you have the prospect for population growth, because they expect that there could be more economic growth from that as well. Age structure affects social organization of families and households. That depends on how much the family transfer system is important. This is a big difference between countries. In European countries, much of the transfers for human capital and old age pensions and social protection happens through the public sector. In Asia, it's much more common that governments rely on families to take care of these needs. So economic life is age structured. This is the basic reason national transfer accounts exists, that our economic lives involve life cycle processes of learning, working, accumulating wealth, and retirement. Those age-determined economic activity. Consumption changes by type and level as we age, and transfer systems are structured by age. We get taxes from working people, and we transfer those to invest in children's human capital and maintain elders' consumption. So the generational economy determines how much age structure changes and how age structure changes will affect our economy. This generational economy is sort of an NTA concept, and we say that it's the way that people produce, consume, share, and save resources by age. So it can be measured by the national transfer accounts. Now, I could talk for a really long time about the technical meat of doing these estimates, but I'll try just to give a general flavor. So we take as our starting point national accounts. GDP, total consumption, every country has some architecture for estimating these aggregates at the national level every year. So we take those as our starting point, and then we use household surveys and government, whatever is available from our governments, to disaggregate those numbers by age. So instead of getting one number for a year of GDP, a measure of total production, I want to know by each age group how much each age group produced. Then also another, because we're interested not just in the production and the consumption, but the transfers, we estimate intra-household sharing models. So that, what I mean by that is that if I can estimate how much each person in a household by age earned from their labor or earned from asset income, and then I can estimate how much each person in a household consumed, I have a sharing model that satisfies the consumption needs of people who earn less than their consumption by transferring from those who earn more. So here's one example of results that we get from the National Transfer Accounts Project. What these are different age profiles from regions of the world by World Bank income groups for labor income. So instead of a total aggregate level of labor income for a year, this is that number pulled apart by age per person in each age group. So it's an average, and the y-axis here is in units of average labor income for peak working ages. So in terms of what the number means, it means sort of units of yearly income of peak working age people. So what we see here are differences in these groups. So the highest income group has the latest entry into the labor force because these young people are spending more time in education. And then the lowest income group, that's the opposite. There's earlier entry into the labor force. And then everybody is sort of going up with age as more people enter the labor force. And then over on the other side, we can see that the highest income countries have earlier retirement that bends down at an earlier age. And then, as you'd expect, to the lowest age group where there's more of a need to keep working and as long as possible, less of an ability to actually retire from the labor force. So this now is the same idea. So they're per capita by age schedules for different regional averages of now consumption. So overall, consumption is lowest for the youngest people, and this is consumption of market goods and services. It increases until adulthood and then is broadly flat, but we can see important differences in these in this characterization by income group. So the richest countries are spending the most on young people. So these are higher levels of investment in education, in health, also just in broad consumption, but generally the biggest factor in those differences is health and education. And then over here, the biggest difference in the fact that the blue line rises so sharply is that right now rich countries are spending a whole lot on the health care of their older populations. In some places, it's mainly through long-term care mechanisms, say nursing homes and institutions. In other places, it's just that healthcare is very expensive. And then older people, even though we saw that they're earning more labor income relative to other regions at these ages, they're spending the least. That's because they're sharing with other household members, they're transferring down to adult children and grandchildren. Okay, so this is sort of a mess, but at least I wanted to show you what some of the individual country lines in the region looked like. So this is consumption. Again, now this is scaled to total consumption, so everybody sort of meets it at 1 in the middle compared to sort of 40-year-olds consumption. What do these look like? So up here, China, you can see that there's a lot of consumption by young people relative to the older age groups. And that is a lot of private education. Chinese parents are spending a lot of their own money to invest in their very small number of kids. And so part of that reason that this is so high is the fertility aspect, because they can take the same amount of money invested in just one child, so that child consumes a lot more than in a place with higher fertility, where there's sort of a household pot of money that's invested in maybe 2 or 3 children. So we have China up here, Japan in green, Thailand. I wish I had Korea on here. They sort of fell out. But anyway, and then on the lower side, there's Cambodia. In the yellow is, who's the yellow? India. Bangladesh is the next one. And then out here, we just see Japan again with this really sort of expensive long-term care provision system. And then much lower in the other countries. So here's this same labor income curve that I showed across these regions for particular countries. Now this is China. This is changing rapidly. This is part of sort of China's rapid development, that you get these particular age groups who come into the labor market at a boom time. And so they are earning a lot more relative to older people. And then here's Cambodia with very early entry into the labor force. Now, when we estimate these labor force curves, it's important to note that we're also including sort of self-employment income, which in rich countries is sort of owning your own business, but in a lot of poor countries is a family farm, subsistence agriculture, and unpaid family workers who are actually making either food for the household to consume or sell. So we impute that and try to add that, and it's not just sort of official formal labor sector or labor market statistics. All right, so as I sort of said, those are kind of a mess. There's a lot of data there. It's just a big jumble of these age profiles. So what if we want a summary measure to understand how age structure is going to affect economic organization? We have the support ratio. The support ratio measures the number of effective workers relative to the number of effective consumers. So what does that mean? Basically, I take those lines that you saw before, which are average for each age group, and I combine them with a population projection, and so multiply the average at each age by the projected size of that age group to get a projected aggregate over time if that age profile stays exactly the same. So I can do that for labor income, and I can do that for consumption, and when I take the ratio, I get a measure of how hard or easy it is for the country to support the existing consumption based on changing age structure. So when the support ratio goes up, that means it gets easier for the country to consume the way it used to, just because age structure changes. When it goes down, the opposite. It's harder to support that consumption. So here is a graph of this support ratio measure for two countries. So starting in 1950, China's support ratio was going down. This was sort of before the effects of lower fertility really made it through the age structure, and year over year, China had more old people and more dependents, more young children. But starting in 1970, that changes. That's when those younger generations get smaller and smaller each year, but the old age cohorts are still relatively small. So the workers in China had few children to support and few elders to support relative to the recent past. So this is the good time. So right about now, the good time is ending. China's big working generations are now going to be replaced by ever smaller generations. The same general pattern in Brazil, but different pace and timing. So starting in about 1970, Brazil heads upward. It's a shell less steep compared to China because Brazil's fertility decline was also less steep compared to China. They have the dividend phase for a little while, but then also have a decline. So what does this support ratio do to overall consumption? This is where we get the idea of the first demographic dividend. So in that line for China, from the period at the bottom of the graph to the top, it is estimated to have contributed 0.8% per year over a period of 39 years to overall consumption. Now, we know that China's growth rate during this period was quite a bit higher than that. So it wasn't the one determinant of China's sort of incredible growth over the period, but it's not nothing. And as we'll see, it's going to matter more in the future. And then for Brazil, 0.5% per annum over a period of 58 years. Oh, whoops. Okay, so but then we're going to see those declines start, and the opposite effect. It will be a decline in overall consumption from demography, all other things sort of held constant. So here is this projected support ratio starting in 2015 for a group of Asian countries. So this just takes the NTA age profiles that I have, moves them forward using UN population projections as weights. So what we see is and scaling everything to 1 in 2015. So Thailand, Japan, Korea, China, their population age structures are going to create a headwind for growth. It's going to be harder for them to grow, harder for them to support consumption. The countries up here, some of them, their dividend period peaks in this period. Some of them, like the Philippines, it keeps going. Philippines' projected age structure is going to make it easier to support overall consumption. So the demographic dividend is, at least as measured by NTA, is this thought experiment. If things in my per capita economy stay as they are today and my population changes, what's going to happen? So that being able to actually realize that, to actually have that thought experiment turn out to have been right, is going to require the right set of policies to be able to realize increased labor force production, because we know that even if everything stays per capita the same, that requires finding jobs for those big new generations coming forward. So that's going to require family planning policies that help maintain in countries that still have high fertility, that help to bring fertility down and create these big working generations. It's going to require investments in children's human capital, and good governance and stability to attract direct foreign investment to make it possible to grow the economy when you have these big generations coming forward. So the dividend, to the extent that it's realized, can be spent. It can be a transitory sort of one-time party, or it can be invested and there has the potential to move a country to a higher growth path going permanently. So the bullets down there, you can have a temporary increase in consumption, you can have a big party, or you can at least save some of it and increase the pool of capital and permanently raise productivity and economic growth. And some of this feeds into what some economists who are studying this call the second demographic dividend. So resources to understand NTA, that's our website up there. And then I wanted to show you a quick video by Thailand Office of National Economic and Social Development Board. So this demographic dividend idea is about creating the potential to have our populations move us to a higher growth path. But that requires a whole set of policies. And so demographic dividend as a policy tool is really trying to motivate policies that are a good idea all the time. It's never a bad idea to invest in children's health. It's never a bad idea to invest in girls' education. It's never a bad idea to have good governance. But what demographic dividend analysis is trying to sort of add to this is that there is a time dimension to this. It might be always a good idea to educate girls, but it's a really good idea if you can educate the girls who are going to be in their peak productive ages and who are going to be a really big generation in, say, 20 years. So, and what the Thailand group did with this video is basically try to get the idea of the age dimension of economic activity out into the population. So there's our website. So let's see if this comes off. So it's in Thai.
คุณเคยรู้ไหมว่าเงินที่เข้าและออกจากกระเป๋าของคุณส่งผลต่อรายได้รวมของประเทศอย่างไรวันนี้เราจะมาเล่าเรื่อง NTA ซึ่งก็คือข้อมูลแสดงที่มาที่ไปของเงินที่เข้าออกกระเป๋าของคนในแต่ละวัยว่าส่งผลกระทบต่อกระเป๋าเงินใหญ่คือกระเป๋าเงินรวมของประเทศอย่างไรบ้างสมมุติว่าเราจะแบ่งช่วงอายุของประชากรออกเป็น3ส่วนใหญ่ๆได้แก่วัยเด็กวัยแรงงานและวัยสูงอายุซึ่งแต่ละวัยจะมีบทบาทของรายได้และรายจ่ายแตกต่างกันออกไปกระเป๋าสตางค์ของวัยเด็กต้องใช้เงินจากกระเป๋าคนอื่นไม่ว่าจะเป็นพ่อแม่หรือรัฐบาลที่จะให้ความช่วยเหลือด้านการศึกษาขั้นพื้นฐานและด้านสุขภาพโดยวัยเด็กจะเป็นวัยที่ได้รับการดูแลจากรัฐมากที่สุดเมื่อเติบโตเป็นวัยทำงานหารายได้เข้ากระเป๋าตัวเองเพิ่มให้ประเทศมีการใช้จ่ายเพื่ออุปโภคบริโภคดูแลคนวัยอื่นพร้อมเก็บออมลงทุนเพื่อเป็นสินทรัพย์ดูแลตัวเองในวัยสูงอายุและเมื่อเข้าสู่วัยสูงอายุเงินในกระเป๋าสตางค์ส่วนใหญ่จะมาจากเงินออมหรือเงินลงทุนของตนเองรวมกับสวัสดิการจากรัฐซึ่งหากมีเหลือจากการบริโภคอุปโภคจะมีการโอนไปให้วัยอื่นๆด้วยจากข้อมูลข้างต้นจะเห็นว่าวัยทำงานเพียงวัยเดียวที่มีรายได้พอจะเป็นรายได้ของรัฐส่วนวัยเด็กและวัยสูงอายุยังคงพึ่งพาสวัสดิการของรัฐและวัยแรงงานเนื่องจากมีรายจ่ายมากกว่ารายได้เมื่อประเทศไทยมีคนวัยทำงานน้อยลงคนสูงอายุมากขึ้นจึงทำให้เงินในกระเป๋าสตางค์ของชาติน้อยลงซึ่งจะมีผลต่อคนทั้งประเทศ ปัจจุบันประชากรวัยแรงงาน 10 คนต้องดูแลผู้สูงอายุ 3 คนและเด็ก 2 คน แต่ในปีพุทธศักราช 2568 ประชากรวัยแรงงาน 10 คนจะต้องดูแลผู้สูงอายุ 4 คนและเด็ก 3 คน และในปี 2578 ประชากรวัยแรงงาน 10 คนจะต้องดูแลผู้สูงอายุถึง 6 คนและเด็ก 3 คน นั่นหมายความว่ารายได้รวมของประเทศจะลดลงเมื่อเทียบกับรายจ่าย และวัยแรงงานที่มีจำนวนน้อยลงต้องแบกรับรายจ่ายของทั้งประเทศมากขึ้น ทางออกของประชากรทุกคนคือการหันมาดูแลกระเป๋าสตางค์ของตัวเอง เริ่มตั้งแต่วัยเด็กที่พ่อแม่ต้องวางแผนชีวิตตั้งแต่การสร้างครอบครัวและเลี้ยงดูบุตรให้เติบโตอย่างมีคุณภาพ วัยรุ่นตั้งใจศึกษาเล่าเรียนพัฒนาตนเองจากสิ่งที่ชอบแล้วต่อยอดในสิ่งที่เลือกให้ดีที่สุด วัยแรงงานก็พัฒนาศักยภาพเพื่อหารายได้เข้ากระเป๋าบริหารเวลาดูแลสุขภาพ ในขณะเดียวกันก็บริหารรายรับรายจ่ายของตนอย่างสมดุลให้มีเงินเหลือเพื่อการออมและการลงทุนอย่างไม่ประมาทเพื่อเก็บไว้ดูแลตัวเองในวัยสูงอายุสามารถใช้ชีวิตวัยเกษียณได้อย่างมีคุณภาพทีนี้คุณก็รู้แล้วว่าเงินในกระเป๋าของคุณเกี่ยวพันกับคนอื่นทั้งในระดับครอบครัวสังคมและประเทศมาร่วมกันสร้างอนาคตของประเทศตลอดช่วงอายุนับตั้งแต่แรกเกิดจนถึงวัยสูงอายุ เริ่มต้นจากตัวคุณเองเพื่อให้กระเป๋าเงินของคุณและอนาคตของประเทศยั่งยืน NTA ข้อมูลรายรับรายจ่ายในแต่ละวัยของคนทั้งประเทศโดย
service delivery, whether it's systems for pensioners or systems for health. Is that the sort of thing that you're talking about?
Yeah, most definitely. So let me see. Okay, so first, what Myanmar would look like on this graph. So to start off with, part of that is we don't know because we don't know what Myanmar's age profiles look like. If we assumed they were something like a cross between Cambodia and Laos and sort of other nearby neighbors, Thailand and Vietnam, the whole region, it would have the same shape as China, but sort of pushed over and not quite, it would be a little less steep, more like Brazil. So the China peak for Myanmar, would, at least in terms of population's age structure, will be about 25 to 30 years later because of when the fertility decline really got going later in Myanmar than China. But depending on sort of how much right now is going to labor income by age versus consumption by age, what the support systems look like, might change that a little bit. But overall, that snaky pattern is kind of, that's what age structure does. And then the profiles will mitigate that a little bit. And then the second question about sort of consuming, and so consuming the dividend versus investing it. So this is sort of the point at which you could decide whether if I have no public old age support system at all, say I'm just relying all on families, and then I look forward, as China is doing now, and saying, okay, given my family support system, I'm going to have plenty of working people who have 2 or more elders to support in their household. And that is unsustainable, and that's too risky because plenty of those elders will actually have no adult children. When in countries also like in Japan, where childlessness is high, you can't really rely on a family structure. It's too risky. So implementing a public policy or a public transfer system, am I going to make it a direct transfer? So like a pay-as-you-go system where I'm taking money directly from workers and giving it to pensioners? Or am I going to try to have some role for a funded scheme, that I'm going to implement a funded scheme so that there's a growing pile of capital? So that is going to be more towards the investing side. So that is able to then say, okay, I have fewer and fewer workers relatively over time, but I have a bigger pool of capital to invest in them. So that's what one of the big policy messages would be from national transfer accounts. Certainly, there's a role for pay-as-you-go pensions. There's definitely a role for social protection for elders who are the most vulnerable to not being able to meet their consumption needs. But to the extent that you can include funded schemes, that you can begin funded schemes, that is going to have important potential growth effects down the road. What else was I going to say about that? I don't remember. But, that's, oh yeah, okay, so I just remember what I was gonna add to that. So part of it also is going to depend on what degree of closed versus open your economy is. So if you have a small open economy, then that capital is going to have constant returns and you might have these dynamics. Also, it might sort of go overseas and then not help you. If you have a closed economy, the more capital you have, that is going to potentially drive down returns, drive down the interest rate, and you might have an equilibrating effect that's going to undermine the potential growth effects of this growing pool of capital. So there's a much more nuanced and detailed story to tell about this, but at least for policy decisions, we feel that the NTA approach to discussing these is at least much more straightforward for policy purposes than like a general equilibrium model that has all these feedbacks and requires 2 PhDs to understand and, is, no offense to those with 2 PhDs, but it serves a very different purpose from something that's much more straightforward. So, thanks.
On the details, so it's really nice to get a presentation on something so fresh. And I just want to ask 2 questions. The first one was, I think there was a graph showing Brazil and China and their current trajectories. I just wanted to...
Support ratio?
Yeah, on the support ratio. I just wanted to understand where Myanmar might fit into that schedule. Just you may have referred to it earlier, but I just wanted to check that. And then, secondly, you made a point about countries that are experiencing or about to experiencing a demographic dividend. They have a choice to sort of consume or invest. I'm just wondering what that means in terms of sort of public policy. I mean, I assume it means something along the lines that if you're having a demographic dividend, the income to consumption ratio is to your advantage, and therefore government revenue per capita is increasing, and therefore governments have a greater opportunity during that time to invest in future service delivery, whether it's systems for pensioners or systems for health. Is that the sort of thing that you're talking about?
Yeah, most definitely. So let me see. Okay, so first, what Myanmar would look like on this graph. So to start off with, part of that is we don't know, because we don't know what Myanmar's age profiles look like. If we assume they were something like a cross between Cambodia and Laos and sort of other nearby neighbors, Thailand and Vietnam, the whole region, it would have the same shape as China, but sort of pushed over and not quite, it would be a little less steep, more like Brazil. So the China peak for Myanmar, at least in terms of population age structure, will be about 25 to 30 years later, because of when the fertility decline really got going, later in Myanmar than China. But depending on sort of how much right now is going to labor income by age versus consumption by age, what the support systems look like, might change that a little bit. But overall, that snaky pattern is kind of, that's what age structure does. And then the profiles will mitigate that a little bit. And then the second question about sort of consuming it. So consuming the dividend versus investing it. So this is sort of the point at which you could decide whether if I have no public old age support system at all, say I'm just relying all on families, and then I look forward, as China is doing now, and saying, okay, given my family support system, I'm going to have plenty of working people who have 2 or more elders to support in their household. And that is unsustainable, and that's too risky because plenty of those elders will actually have no adult children. When in countries also like in Japan, where childlessness is high, you can't really rely on a family structure. It's too risky. So implementing a public policy or a public transfer system, am I going to make it a direct transfer? So like a pay-as-you-go system where I'm taking money directly from workers and giving it to pensioners? Or am I going to try to have some role for a funded scheme? That I'm going to implement a funded scheme so that there's a growing pile of capital. So that is going to be more towards the investing side. So that is able to then say, okay, I have fewer and fewer workers relatively over time, but I have a bigger pool of capital to invest in them. So that's what one of the big policy messages would be from national transfer accounts. Certainly there's a role for pay-as-you-go pensions. There's definitely a role for social protection for elders who are the most vulnerable to not being able to meet their consumption needs. But to the extent that you can include funded schemes, that you can begin funded schemes, that is going to have important potential growth effects down the road. What else was I going to say about that?
Is a kind of an open question. I mean, it's not
Okay.
a question,
Yeah.
it's more a
Yeah.
reflection.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you. I couldn't have planted a bunch of better questions to sort of have the chance to discuss some of the things that I didn't really have time to bring in, but just more complex issues. So first of all, on the migration issue. So we have many countries in the National Transfer Accounts project. And again, to emphasize, we have something like 68 countries now, and it's sort of growing all the time. So each country research team, whether they're an academic group, whether they're a government research or think tank, or government accountants, has its own agenda and can modify and can add to the methodology to answer its particular most pressing questions. So, for example, the Philippines, the role of migrant labor is very important for them, and they have a big infrastructure at the government level to monitor migrants and whether they consider how long the contracts are, whether they're short-term migrants, long-term migrants, are they residents, are they from overseas. And so they have a big extra sort of piece of the analysis to figure out how much money is coming in from migrants, or how much of sort of migrants are leaving and not coming back. And for them, it's important to have analyses saying the extent to which migrants do come home is keeping us from losing, X percent of GDP growth a year. So that's really useful for them in policy discussions of talking about maintaining all the infrastructure around immigration instead of trying to fight it or instead of ignoring it. So if that was an issue in Myanmar, certainly data would be hard to find, because when it's completely informal flows, when there is no government architecture to monitor and support this system, then you just have to start guessing and using whatever you have. But also I find that really a lot of good analyses can be done using the sort of guess, or as you would call it, because you don't want to write guess in your report, scenario-based, am I right? A sort of scenario-based analysis that if the migration is thus, then we see these kinds of costs and benefits, and alternative scenarios as you can come up with them reasonably. All right, so then the issue of subgroups in the country. So this is a big issue for the network as a whole. Hopefully I'll get a little time to talk about our first sort of big disaggregation effort, which is to disaggregate by gender. So each one of those lines, as you noted, is an average for everybody. But when there are really distinct sort of subgroups, that average doesn't represent a single person. Also, in the face of inequality, that average is affected by the big skew that inequality has in any average. So we're working on, and we already have the methodology, just need the time and data sources to allow disaggregation of those lines. And so then you can look at questions such as, is my public transfer system taking from one group and giving to another in a way that is either unfair or inefficient? Or say, is inequality different by age group? Do I have poor children and rich old people? Things like this. So once we get to those subgroup disaggregations, we can ask a lot more really interesting questions, and it depends on particular countries' research needs, which of those kinds of questions they ask. All right, and then Yeah, general sort of the political economy idea is we are very agnostic about, what you should do. I can make general recommendations of sort of costs and benefits of different things, but we are a network of country teams, and so each country team is sort of facing the political landscape in their countries in their own way. So did I forget any big pieces? Okay.
You can answer them.
All right. But those were terrific questions, and thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So what we're going to do is just take a break and probably get more questions.
Okay, so I'm gonna sort of walk around a little more, gesticulate a little more, probably tie myself up in knots. But so now I'd like to move from trying to introduce the National Transfer Accounts project as it exists now and the basic sort of results we get about it from the demographic dividend and get a little more complex. So, and talk about sort of two groups of mitigating factors in the basic analysis. So one is the role of physical and human capital. So that support ratio really just looked at consumption and labor income and said these things are going to stay the same by age forever, and we'll see what that looks like with population. But the dynamics with physical and human capital can make the story very different. And then the second mitigating factor that I hope to spend a lot of time on is what's left out of the model entirely. Lots of things, but the one I'd like to focus on is gender and unpaid care work. So to start off with physical and human capital, so, and we did discuss this in some of the question and answers earlier, but so if saving is part of the life cycle, then aging populations will hold more wealth. So this is seen in most countries with sort of more mature economies. The oldest people have the most wealth, earn the most asset income. They've accumulated over their lifetimes, and if you looked at the asset income profile, which is another part of NTA, it's highest at the oldest ages. Now, in some countries where things are changing very rapidly, it's actually going to be younger people. So if younger people, say 40-year-olds or something, came into the labor market during the big boom years, their parents may be very low income and they're going to have more wealth. But in general, as economies mature, we end up with older people holding more of the wealth. So that means that aging is actually going to mean more available wealth, more available capital that can be invested to make labor more productive. So that's what oftentimes is referred to as the potential second demographic dividend. And again, that's going to have the same dynamics of whether you're an open or closed economy, whether there are feedbacks, and also, of course, the whole global economic situation that you're accumulating this capital in the middle of. So part of the big story of the Asian tigers, Korea and Taiwan, is that they had this accumulation happen during a time of rapid global economic expansion. Lucky for them. Many other countries, that's not going to be the case. They still can have a benefit from this, but it's going to be a smaller one than, say, Taiwan had during its period of rapid growth, which corresponded with this generational advantage in productive capacity. Then there is human capital. So human capital is going to have some of these same dynamics, and part of that is going to be what demographers call the quantity-quality trade-off. So when your quantity of children is lower, you can take the same pool of resources and invest more in each child. And we talked about some of those dynamics, say in the difference on spending on children in China versus Bangladesh, where the fertility is higher. So with lower fertility, each child can receive more human capital investment, and those education and health investments can lead to future productivity gains. So in an aging future, there's potential for a second demographic dividend, not just from physical capital, but also from these human capital dynamics. So now moving on to unpaid care work not being included in the analysis. This is another mitigating factor. So this table is about classifies production by goods versus services, and then those services that are sold in the marketplace versus those produced and consumed in the household. And then for each cell in this 2x2 table, whether it's included in national accounts or not. And this is what national accountants call the production boundary. What is included, it's basically what they say the economy is versus what it's not. So goods and services sold in the marketplace, obviously both included, traded for money, easy to measure, and obviously production. Now goods included, goods produced and consumed in the household, those are also included in GDP. So in national accounts, they try to impute the amount of, say, food that is subsistence farmed and consumed by the family. Also goods that are produced for household own use. So those things are imputed. National accounts try to guess how much of all of this is taking place and what the value of it is. Now, certainly in some places they have the ability to make a good guess, an accurate guess. In some places they make a bad guess. In some places they make no guess at all. But at least theoretically, these goods that are not market goods are included in GDP. The one that's not included is services produced and consumed in the household. So I can most clearly delineate this by talking about a family that farms its own potato. So the amount of production to grow the potato, to harvest it, to bring it up to the household door, that is included in GDP. The work that goes to clean it, to cook it, to serve it, to clean up after it is not included. So many economists point out that this is a very arbitrary boundary. So if it's a good, it's included. If it's an unpaid service, it's not. Now, I want to make a distinction about unpaid work. So there's unpaid work, say, that we do for a family farm or a household-owned business. Plenty of kids work on the household farm or work for household-owned enterprises. They're not paid, but still their labor is at least imputed in national accounts. So that's not what I'm talking about when I'm discussing unpaid care work. Okay, so this not included cell is really unpaid care and housework, and it's most often done by women. So it's fascinating to go back and sort of read the accounts of the development of the national accounts system. There were explicit discussions of this. And at the time, they said, well, this is really hard to measure. And certainly in the 20s and 30s, they didn't have a time use survey. It was a much harder proposition to measure. But I can't help but think, because those were all men sitting in that room and talking about what is production and what is not, that, they didn't see at the time. So this is there's a gendered economy and there's gendered economic measurement. And this has long been pointed out by feminist scholars. Now, actually, one final note. So I did talk to a colleague outside who was working on environmental issues. So environmentalists make a similar point about GDP, that it does not include the spending down of natural capital. The fact that the earth is producing services for us that we're consuming, but that's not part of GDP. So this critique about unpaid care work is part of a family of critiques of GDP. That it's not measuring welfare by any means, and it's not even actually measuring what you would theoretically call an economy. So counting women's work is the national transfer accounts attempt to include this unpaid care work piece in our system. So what that means is that this is a sort of an existing household satellite accounting methodology to use time use surveys to measure how much time people spend in unpaid care work. And I'll use this UCW acronym for a while. So that includes direct care activities, the time I spend caring for my children, the time my mom spends taking her elderly father to the doctor and things like that. So direct care work, and also indirect care through housework, household management and maintenance. Basically the work that invests in children's human capital, that enables market work by household members, and that keeps the household system running. So once I know how much time people spend on these activities, then I value that time by a replacement wage. So there are lots of ways to do this, and the way the National Transfer Accounts system imputes a market wage this time is to use a replacement method. So as to ask, if I didn't spend an hour cooking for my family and instead I wanted to pay someone else to do that hour, how much would they earn doing that work? So this is in contrast to the opportunity cost method, which would value the time by saying, if I didn't want to do that cooking myself, but rather wanted to use that hour to do more demography, how much would I earn? So you can see that those are very different. I earn a lot more as a demographer than the average cook does, thank God. But also, if I were in an accounting framework to say that the amount of time I spend cooking produces more cooking because I'm a good demographer, so, in an accounting framework, I wouldn't want to say that. When I spend an hour of doing laundry, I produce about as much laundry as somebody who does it, arguably you could say even less, that somebody who's doing it in the market is going to be much better at it than I am. But at least, so we're going to do a replacement market wage for that. And then not only am I going to estimate how much of all of this care work is produced, I'm going to impute the consumption so that I'll get not only the labor income version for unpaid care work, I'm also going to get the consumption curve, time. So I take all the hours my economy spends on market work, all the hours my economy spends on unpaid care work, and compare the shares. So then when I apply these imputed wages, I get the orange bar. So unpaid care work value as a proportion of the total money produced. So you can see that the bars are very different, and that in most all the countries, the orange bars are significantly lower than the blue bars. So why is that? That's a lot of reasons. One is that the imputed wage for all of these things is very low. So is the imputed wage low because those are very low productivity activities? Or is the imputed wage for these things low because of a history of gender discrimination, which said that childcare is performed by women, we don't have to pay them very much for it, so childcare workers, teachers have a low salary. Or that, say, women are the only ones who can be teachers. So there's an enormous pool of labor to be teachers, so the wage, the sort of market wage that comes out of that big pool of potential workers is lower. So our estimates aren't able to see sort of which factor is at play in these countries, but can at least be a tool to highlight that difference, that there's a big gap in how much time we spend by gender as at work versus how much we earn, and in the market as well. So here's an example from India that shows the full set of accounts. So over here in green for India, and granted this is kind of old, but so male labor income, and this is monetary value, female labor income in India, and then here's the single sex consumption. Our tools are not really able to look within households at gender discrimination very well, so I am generally just showing the one line for consumption. But what you see here on the market side is that women are never earning more for any age group than their consumption. So pretty much all, on average, every age group of women is having to receive a transfer from men. But you look at the national time transfer accounts, which is what we call in Accounting Women's Work, the sort of unpaid care work version of our accounts, you see the opposite. So there's a lot of this production by women and very little by men. You also see a really different consumption pattern here. So in market goods and services, children are the least expensive of any age group. In terms of unpaid care work, they're the most expensive. So if you are thinking in terms of an economic analysis about the costs of children, or whether, say, fertility is artificially low because it's too expensive to have kids, you want to include this in your analysis about the cost of children, or you're missing most of the story. And then finally in the purple, here is when we put these two pieces together, what you see is a life cycle that looks a lot more similar for men and women. So this sort of household system of exchange is very much at work in India. It's at work in every other country we've looked at, mine included very much so. On average, there are plenty of households where women are earning more than men and providing all of their own consumption, but on average, we still see in every country this sort of household system of specialization, the gendered economy, that we really live in, we have different economic lives. So here, this is now just going back to only thinking about market work. So in a lot of planning, countries with a rapid aging problem are talking about the future of their economies, that they need to close that gap between men and women, that labor. So India is very much salient of this gap, and they are talking about how to close it. So, and the reason that they want to do that is that in a future of population aging, where are your workers going to come from? That's a potential pool. So this graph shows how much closing those labor income gaps has the potential to sort of solve the support ratio problem that aging brings. So the dark bar shows our average annual rate of change in the support ratio from 2014, I did this a few years ago, to 2050, if everything stays exactly as it is today. So that's sort of my basic support ratio. The lighter bars say, what if I'm able to close that gap by 50%, the gap that you saw in labor income for India? So for India, that's going to take what would be a modest increase in their support ratio and make it a really big increase. So India has, because their labor force participation is so different, there's great potential here. Uruguay was a quite a bit older Latin American country. If they close that, and also has a pretty big gap too, if they close that gap, they would get a substantial increase. A country like Argentina goes from negative to positive, as does Mexico. Same for US, Costa Rica. For China, it will help, but it won't get you all the way there, because China's labor force by gender, participation by gender, is the gap is not that great. So there's not as much potential there. Certainly there's a wage gap that still needs to be addressed, but it's not as big as in many other countries. So it will help China's aging problem, but it can't solve it. But this is the kind of analysis, at least, that we can offer countries to understand, if you push on gender equality, how far along the road to solving this support problem could you get? Now, another thing that we tell countries when we talk about this stuff, or when we write up policy analyses, is that, as you saw, unpaid care work, women are already doing plenty of work. And this graph for that same set of countries that I showed but first shows how much so. So this is just in terms of time. The green bar shows differences, each bar shows differences in average hours worked per week for these peak working ages, age 30 to 50. So specialization. So if it's above 0, men are doing more of it. If it's below, women are doing more of it. So men in every one of these countries are doing more market work than women on average. Women in every one of these countries are doing more unpaid care work than men. And in places like Mexico and India, we're talking the difference of like full-time jobs. You know, this is 30 to 40 or more hours a week. And then we also see that in every single one of these countries, in this age group, women are doing more total work. So any country who is going to try to increase female labor force participation, unless they want to endanger the well-being of women, or perhaps spend a lot on a policy that doesn't go anywhere, that doesn't have any uptake, people don't choose to work more, will have to reckon with unpaid care work. So either through trying to provide more market sources, provide more childcare, after-school programs, things like that, to make it more possible for women to reduce some of their unpaid care work burden and, say, shift that time to paid work, or are going to have to try to get men to do some more of it. So this shows, support ratios, this is one example for Mexico, how adding these different factors affects the overall sort of thought experiment of this support ratio, that what's going to happen to it as my population age structure changes with adding different aspects. So starting this out in 2010 so the basic support ratio for Mexico rises to 2030 and then falls through the end of the century. If I add unpaid care work, it goes up, it starts falling much later and ends up higher. Now, it's sort of the thought experiment gets a little weird here because unpaid care work is time. So what this thought experiment now is saying, so my population's going to get older, there will be fewer children in it. That means women will have a decreased burden of childcare. I'm not going to have to spend that much time, transfer that much time to children if I have fewer of them. So if I turn every additional unit of free time that I get from having fewer children to care for, and then I turn every one of those minutes into market work, that's what I would get on the effect of my support ratio. Now, of course, women may just choose to, or households may choose to allocate that time towards more leisure or towards more intensive care for fewer numbers of children. So there could be a quantity-quality trade-off in unpaid care work time, just like there is in market goods and services. So those would have different dynamics. Now, any one of those would be welfare enhancing, we would expect, but this thought experiment at least says that all of that time is transferred into market work. Then up here, so if I take this blue support ratio but instead add asset income, which in Mexico accrues very strongly to the oldest age groups, then, so these things are basically saying that unpaid care work time says, hey, aging is not so bad because children are really expensive. Now, this green line says, hey, aging is not so bad because old people have a lot of money, have a lot of assets. And then this much more speculative line adds both of those effects. And you can see that you're really in a much different world about population aging. So that's another thing that the National Transfer Accounts Project has tried to emphasize, that there are all of these mitigating factors in a future of countries really worried about aging populations that actually might make below replacement or somewhat low fertility not so bad. Okay, so I have a few more slides that I could just ramble on about forever, but I think this is a good spot to see if there are any other questions or more points to discuss. But I think there's also a big case to be made for the fact that the institutions that supported high fertility, so for a long time you really had to push high fertility in a high mortality context or your population goes away. So what supports high fertility? Cultural expectations of female roles, exactly. Differential human capital investments. And this is all, and so those institutions now don't need to support high fertility. Nobody needs high fertility anymore, but these institutions are still around. They're just sort of these creepy dinosaurs. You know, so, and that it's going to take a lot longer to change that system. One example from Counting Women's work is that, and other time use studies, is that as young as we can observe people's time use, there's a really distinct difference in what girls and boys are doing for unpaid work. So boys are working on household enterprises, farms, they're doing farm work, they're working in the store. Girls are taking care of younger siblings. So as young as we can observe these differences, they're shaping human capital in very different ways towards a gendered economy as we know it now, not towards some robot future economy, like, you know, not towards what might be important in the future. So certainly there's a robust discussion, you know. So I think that we have institutions that supported the gendered economy, high fertility, that are just really slow to change.
Would you like to continue or come to go to the end?
Let me see.
This is a good point to break.
Yeah, I think it's a good point to break. So let's see if there was anything really good. Yeah.
Okay, no, very good.